Get into it. I want to start by saying that a lot of this conversation can often come down to, or like, look how messed up boys are when they're brought up by single mothers, and there can be a lot of shitting on single mothers, and I can understand where that comes from, and I can even say anecdotally that some of the most messed up children I've ever known were boys brought up by single mothers. There's just something about that dynamic that seems particularly unhealthy. But I do think that it is unfair as a blanket rule to always blame the mothers, because sometimes they keep the fathers away, like was asked about in this question. That's absolutely true. But then there are also deadbeat dads who abandon their families, and fuck those guys. And you know, the fact that the man grows up without a male role model, that's on the father. Sometimes the mother doesn't let the father come close, and that's on the mother. But like, it is nuanced, and sometimes feel like that distinction is actually missed. The thing that you need to be particularly cautious of here is, you know, like if you grew up with a single mother, is you might be well versed to actually spend a day Googling something called surrogate spouse syndrome, or what can be called emotional incest. And this is when a woman, it can happen with a father as well, but we'll talk about it from a gender perspective. When a woman lacks a husband and lacks a father for her child, she begins to rely upon a son that she has for the emotional support and the practical needs that she would ordinarily get from her partner. So essentially, like, imagine father's not around, you've got a 13-year-old son, so some of the things that you'd ordinarily vent about with regards to your life, like the friends that you don't like, your stresses about money or whatever, you start to vent to that son, and you turn him into that surrogate spouse. And it is understandable why in a weak moment you might start to establish that pattern and treat them less like a child and you being the parent, but because you have no support as a parent, you start to treat them like a parent, and maybe, you know, you encourage them to help you raise the younger siblings or whatever like that. But the consequences are absolutely disastrous. It is really, really bad for a young boy to be foisted with that much responsibility early on. If you ask men who've had this experience, often they'll deny that. They'll say, no, it's the best thing for me, made me grow up, made me be a man. And look, sometimes that can happen. I'm not saying there's no exceptions, but on the whole, they're kidding themselves. It is being rushed in your development at your own expense. It's for her sake, you know, like, it benefits her in the short term, but it's in the long term at your expense, because you're being forced to rush growing up. You're being forced into an emotional relationship as a kind of equal with a woman who should have a very clear boundary. She is the parent and you're the child. And it has a huge impact on how that person has romantic relationships in the future. And let's talk about that, because it can often go one of two ways. What often happens is that the man grows up to be